So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Proverbs. Currently in chapter 29. We finished last time with, verse 6, and we're going to continue now with verse 7. I mentioned last episode that I wanted to start each one of these with a prayer. And I think it's a good practice so far. So we're going to start with that and then get into the verse. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. I have been blessed by good fortune to have people around me, friends and family. I know that I can work to improve my appreciation of that. I know that I need to work myself away from a solitary and selfish posture so that I can be more open, more receptive to exchanging or conversing with friends and family. I thank you for my opportunities to grow and to learn at work. And I thank you for the insight that we are afforded, that there is so much in front of us that we can choose to pay attention to if we are able to. If we are able to convince ourselves that something is worth paying attention to. And as I sit here on a Sunday, on the eve of a new week, surely a busy week as it always is, I would like to say that my intention for the week is to keep you in mind, to keep the spiritual side of myself at the forefront in my dealings with others and in dealings with myself. And it is my hope that in those dealings with myself, I find a just conclusion or conclusions, that I make effective decisions, I make wise choices. And with all of this, I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So verse 7, the righteous considers the cause of the poor, but the wicked regards not to know it. Now this is a verse right off the bat that I like. And immediately, without really diving into it, what I'm drawn to is the quality of the righteous that is concerned with the causes of things. As an aside, I think it's hard for me not to mention. My mind is just fixed on it. I had gone through a period of my life where I rejected all faith-based domains, claims. I felt that they were useless, not worthwhile. I was effectively an atheist, although I usually classified myself as an agnostic because I couldn't reasonably commit to the idea that there was no God because I couldn't prove it. And now, although faith seems to be never a certain thing. It is something, regardless of the exact way of things, of the exact cause of things, directs the mind to attention and ultimately to goodness. It is up to the individual not to be dissuaded and corrupted on that journey, if they choose to accept the journey. But along the way, on this agnostic, atheistic track, what I believed was that the faithful person believes out of ignorance. Now, I can't say that there are no cases for which this is the truth. Surely there are plenty of strange and nonsensical things when it comes to the spiritual life and faith. There are many charlatans and people that wish to profit off of religious and spiritual sensibilities. More broadly speaking, I live in the United States, and in the United States when I was growing up, especially when I was in high school, there was a cultural push shared by the United Kingdom, surely, and us, that this cultural wave of religious suppression, that it was not in the interest of the people to be involved in religious affairs, because, again, it was against some logical norm, some who knows exactly what. But it deprived, I think, a lot of people in my generation of something richer, more poetic, intellectually more stimulating. Along with this culture, I think, came in that conception that the religious people were not concerned with the causes of things. Certainly, they were not considered with the causes of material things. How could a religious person believe that the earth is 6,000 years old? How could a person believe in any of the things that are miraculous in the Bible? And some of them I still struggle with. Others I've come to accept in my own way, some of which the acceptance of them have changed me for the better. They've changed my life. But this is the process of faith. Coming to know something is not an easy task. Being honest in that process throughout the entirety of it is not an easy thing. But the whole way, what we are concerned with is the cause of things, and the truthful cause of things. Now, I had spoken last episode about a topic that I've called spiritual mechanics. Spiritual mechanics is a domain of human cognition, I would say, as a matter of the mind projecting and experiencing. It is something that involves the agent, but also something that involves other minds in the landscape, and ultimately the possibility of a transcendent mind, or a mind that, for what we consider to be the cause of all material phenomena, and of course conscious experience is related to those phenomena, the cause of all of this having some purposeful or meaningful inception. And so again, regardless of exactly how we find ourselves into the spiritual life, spiritual mechanics are the mechanism by which we can walk our way into faith, and again, the religious life, and just the way that we make sense of things. And it inevitably involves our intimate personal experiences. There are many warnings in the Old Testament and in the Proverbs. I'm looking at a verse right now that warns against believing the heart. We know that in the scientific way, the scientific method of approaching a problem, we do our best to remove ourselves from the situation so that we don't introduce confounding information or bias, which is important to do. But all the same, the absolute denial of the self is not possible. We are agents that experience. True objectification is nonsensical. We may objectify various problems, but ultimately our experience is our experience. The self will find its place in that domain, in life, and it's hard to say exactly. The self will find its place in experience, maybe. It will find its place in understanding. I think that's a better way to put it. It will find its place in knowing that it doesn't necessarily come to know because it excludes itself, but rather it includes itself as a part of that process. And so I say this not to say that I don't like the scientific method. I think it's excellent. It's an excellent way of understanding truth. I utilize it all of the time at work. But what I also utilize, thankfully, to this idea of spiritual mechanics, just as much as we rely on something like physical mechanics, material mechanics, the spiritual mechanics help me understand what goodness is, what appropriate behavior is, and it moves me away from an arbitrary sense of things. Although I can't claim to know what the absolute way of things are, given certain relationships, it becomes easier to know what is good given a particular situation. And if a situation, especially in interpersonal communication, if that tends to go south or has a negative air to it, working my way through that gracefully is a skill, and it requires, I think, at least to a degree, an understanding of spiritual mechanics, even into the most atheistic of minds. So another reason that I gravitate towards this verse is that there are certain types of verses in the Proverbs. Some of them bring up righteousness, and it's quite clear that what we are prompted to do is to consider righteousness for the sake of righteousness. And we are not really given any clues as to what it is. And we go through the exercise a number of times, and we come to an understanding that there's really nothing about the definition of the word righteousness that will tell us what the word righteousness means, ironically enough. And so we are forced to go into our own experiences or experiences that we have observed in others and give it a framework to live on. It's much like the idea of liberty. It's not something that can be isolated alone. It almost needs, of course, a definition helps, but the definition only gets us so far. If we want to be liberated, or if we want to be righteous, it's not enough to know the definition for us to be that thing. It's something that we have to practice. It's something that we have to understand. It's something that we have to understand our relationship to. In the case of liberation, what are we liberating from? What is the desired state? Because liberation for the sake of liberation will separate us from all bonds. separating from us from all bonds will cause us to be sort of like a tourniquet. A spiritual tourniquet will be placed on us. And I think we would atrophy and that we would decay consciously. That would lead to absence. That would be a type of evil or wickedness in and of itself. But if we are unjustly, that's another term, difficult, but if we find ourselves in a situation for which the bonds are severely limiting our maybe potential in a way, growth, development, ability to experience love, maybe that's a better way to conceptualize it. Then it is the case that we ought to make a change towards liberating ourselves from those constraints. And so this sort of thing is much different than liberating ourselves from constraints for the sake of liberation. But in order to do the former, we must consider the cause of our afflictions. In the context of righteousness, we don't necessarily just have to talk about liberation. We can talk about any number of things. About being good is quite a large category, a large topic to consider. A particular example about behavior, I think, is easier. I can give one now, one that happened today, actually. A few that happened today, but I'll focus on one. Now, today being a Sunday, usually on Sundays I go over to a friend's house and I have dinner with an extended group of friends. And I've mentioned this before, but I have a strange personality I've come to notice. And I've been trying my best to improve myself, as one does when they are aware of themselves and wishes to be better and to do good. So many times I fail. But I have painfully become aware of my silence. And I'm aware of my silence not because I know that I don't literally speak much. And I don't want to be too unfair. Of course, I engage with my friends. They're my friends after all. But I tend to be a more reserved and quiet individual. And I think where this is a problem is when my mind is really not active, that I'm not putting my foot forward and discussing with my friends about their lives, how things have been going, what things they have found to be interesting, and this sort of thing. When I become shut down, selfish, there tends to come this sense or air of defensiveness out of nowhere. There could be any sort of conversation that emerges. There is now it is not as bad as it used to be, of course, but there is, at least in my mind, initial irritation. And I found myself thinking today, why? Why is it the case that you are irritated right now? Now, some things are just inherently irritating. That's a part of human interaction. But to the extent to which I can move past that so I can have productive conversations with my friends, I'm concerned about it. And I think this brings us to the first lesson, or the first, at least in my mind, the first thing that we can gain or learn from this verse, the first lesson of the verse, not from me. But the first lesson that I take from this is that when I am considering the righteous life, when I see a problem, I must think about the cause. And this is, as simple as it sounds, it's not immediately clear, because there are plenty of times in life where I experience something a bit adverse. Maybe I am aware that something isn't quite on the mark, and I just sort of let it go and let it subside. And this sort of thing is not good, because nothing is solved. Behavior stays the same. I don't change as a person. And so the first thing that I want to sift through here is sort of an intimate example, thinking about the causes of why I find this behavior with my friends on Sunday, the Sunday dinners, why I find it to be poor when I don't engage as I know that I ought. And I would also like to extend this out a little bit into a domain that's a little bit more general to my day-to-day life, most of which is occupied with work. But before we do that, today's a new day. And as always, a new day brings new thoughts. And I would like to open this segment of recording with a prayer. So, dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you that I can have the opportunity to reflect, to look back on my behavior, to ask myself if I am actually, if I am doing right. I thank you that there is something that is indicating to me that the good life, the righteous life, though it may not be straightforward, that at the very least the attention is called. The attention is called upwards. And I thank you that today, while I may fail tomorrow, today was an attentive day. I recognize points of failure throughout the day, but these points were met by appropriately placed attention and a rebounding of attention that I would like to see more of. And in this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So as I discussed just a moment ago, and in that last bit of recording, I would like to get into an intimate situation here, to explore something. The righteous considers the cause of the poor, but the wicked regards not to know it. So as I warm up my mind, I think it's worth mentioning that throughout the Proverbs, the word poor has many potentials to it. Sometimes it's fairly straightforward. Sometimes there's a material substance quality or aspect to it that we are obliged to think about things in that light, in that domain. People without. But broadening this out, and I think that this is one of the verses that affords us this opportunity of broadening it out. Broadening it out in the sense that poverty, or a state of lacking, or a state of being without, extends much more than just the material circumstance that we find ourselves in. Often the material circumstance is interwoven in many different aspects of our life and our psychology. So it is certainly not nothing, but I want to separate that for a moment and focus on the aspects of mind that can become impoverished, independent of this material destitution. And bringing the mind back to two examples here. One that I've mentioned about the Sunday dinners, in which I do not participate as I should. And the second is my working life and the participation there, because undoubtedly the aspects of myself that I wish to correct, the aspects of myself that are lacking, do not just stop at the Sunday dinner. It carries throughout the whole of me. And so this Sunday dinner, beginning there, what I find so distasteful about my behavior is that I find, again I've mentioned this, but I find at times a degree of irritability that I use as an excuse for my mind to become inattentive and to dissociate from the experience, and that I may not necessarily justify anything to myself, but I know it's uncomfortable, and I know that it's not something that should be. Not that every moment of life and that every moment of experience ought to be comfortable, but because of the uncomfortability of it, I give myself the excuse to move out of a state of attention. And of course this outside of the state of attention is an unproductive state of mind. It is a mind that tends towards absence. It is a type of evil, I think. And the way, I think, to correct this, the way around this, is by ignoring well, maybe not ignoring, but acknowledging, accepting, and then moving past that reality of the heart. That although there is no particular reason that my heart may be producing a particular feeling, the sense of general irritability, but it is. And it's my opportunity, it's my duty, if I don't like it, to change it. And so I think it can be changed by a willful action. It may be painful to dig out of the pit, let's say, the pit of negative emotion, but it's something necessary, I think, to maintain strong relationships. And this is something that I need to work on, especially under conditions of fatigue, which I know that tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow evening, when I come back to this recording, I will be under one of those states of mind. I will be challenged. Right now, for whatever reason, I feel okay. And I'm thankful for these experiences, that my mind is not overly burdened. And it can be something simple, overly burdened by just being tired and exhausted. Yet the desire and the will is there to have an experience of life that is meaningful and worthwhile. So we'll see how this manifests tomorrow, and how, if we move on to the next verse between now and then, what my thoughts on it will be. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is how this constancy of my personality is carried into my working life. And today, I felt more aware, and this is the principal concern, I think, of that introductory prayer. I'm very thankful that because of the session that was completed yesterday, of just thinking about the righteous considering the cause of the poor, the righteous considering the cause of things, the righteous considering the cause of lacking, and fundamentally that impoverished state of mind at my friend's house or at work is something within the domain of this verse. I think it's undeniable that this is a place that is where the mind ought to go to be productive. Now, not every nature of my job is interesting. I'm afforded many different snapshots throughout the day. I suppose I can call them meetings. I meet with many different people. But again, I'm afforded a certain opportunity to really get into situations and start something new. Whereas one situation may end, I may find myself on a new path and a new trajectory. But keeping in mind here that we're talking about lacking, we're talking about poverty, I want to bring up, or at least try to bring up in some way, the situations today that have brought me to an understanding of that lacking. One of them comes to mind. I'm not sure how useful this is going to be, but one of them comes to mind. It has to do with dealing with a particular type of person or personality. A very communicative type of personality. Some people might call it a type A, maybe an anxious personality. There are different ways, I think, that one can characterize this pattern of behavior. But I tend to be quite reserved, and part of that is a guilt. Maybe not a guilt, but part of that is an expression of behavior that is inattentive, that leads to guilt. And in dealing with people that are constantly communicative, even if it's not productive communication, and I don't reciprocate well, I think it has a negative effect on the relationship. But also I'm not living up to the challenge that my attention needs to be brought to a higher level, to be able to handle a conversation that may not necessarily have all that much value in it, a fairly shallow conversation, but a lot of information, a lot of shallow information to process and to digest and to reciprocate. I think there is a duty, given this shallowness, to turn it into something that is where it lacks, again, where I find an impoverishment in terms of its lacking of value, and turn it into something that is a little bit more substantive. And turning it in this domain, this dimension, I think prompts both parties into a way of communicating, a certain wavelength, if you will, of meaning. And not every conversation needs to be a super in-depth or intellectual or emotional conversation. However, I think it is better to steer a conversation into a meaningful tide rather than to have it inundated by meaningless dribble that at the end effectively has no greater effect than if the mind was to give itself to absence and to nothingness. And so my failure in this situation, I think, is number one, expressing the care and the concern to go with this person somewhere. And number two, I would say it's the ability for my mind to keep up, in effect. Now, I can hear plenty of opinions in my mind, especially of a coworker or a friend who would give advice, probably saying that you need to, I've heard this before, you need to draw a bubble around yourself to protect yourself, psychologically. Some people really take it out of you. They communicate, they talk so much that it will drain you. And I think there's a certain element of that which is true. But also I think there's a certain element in which if I am providing somebody with a service, I ought to be on top of my mind. I ought to be paying attention, and I ought to direct the conversation in a sophisticated manner, in a judicious manner. And I suppose it's useful to say here that I don't necessarily think that this means that because I feel this way that I see myself as somehow the one that will save the conversation. I merely think that the righteous person, when they discuss the cause of lacking or reflect on the cause of lacking, their duty is to steer the ship. They are not the one that controls the environment. The environment is as it is. And depending on how somebody responds to that articulation, then the righteous person considers it and navigates that sea towards whatever is good. And there may be some good in some superficial conversation, but there also, again, may be good in directing another's attention to something that's less of a state of mind that is rambling circularly. There's another thing that probably more important, that occurs probably every day, at least an element of it that I grab onto, but not enough where I make it explicitly understood in my mind. So I'm going to try to do that now. I think there's an aspect of my behavior for which I don't articulate as well as I should. Articulate my thoughts, or attend strongly enough such that I can form sophisticated thoughts and articulate them in a way that is useful. Now, this happens every day intermittently. It doesn't happen constantly, thankfully, but to the degree that I find myself lacking attentively, lacking meaningfully, I come back to first principles. The principles for which two people are brought together. This is something that ought to be brought into the center, that mantelpiece. It is what is propped up on that altar, so to speak, of the immediate conversation or relationship. And that thing ought to be nurtured. It is something that I think takes some time to find a reciprocal environment between one person and another, such that the attention is flowing around the object or the principle. The attention is flowing around the principle. And I think what the mind that tends towards righteousness ought to do is to take the principle and build on that principle, so the attention flows. It continues to move in some direction. The direction is solving some problem, putting pieces of a puzzle together, such that the other mind is engaged and part of the process of solving the problem. And I can't see how the end of that, even if it's a failure in terms of understanding, at least the exercise has been conducted, at least attention is paid. And in the end, if something has not solved the problem, at least a greater understanding of where not to go in the next reiteration of that cycle or exercise is made known. The parties are aware of it. And in the case that it is something that is productive and solves an issue, I think then all the better. There is room for satisfaction in that case. The righteous considers the cause of the poor, but the wicked regards not to know it. So let's dive into the wicked a little bit here. I've conceptualized of the wicked before as a person that may be on the road to evil. I think there's wicked tendencies in all of us, just as there are foolish tendencies in all of us. Sometimes I wonder about conceptualizing the self as an inside-outside dynamic, that there is an inside that we call the self, and that there is an outside called the environment. And I think there is a degree of truth in that. I don't want to get myself too caught up in one thing or another in this domain, but in the sense that I think it's useful to think about something as inside, is when I feel myself speaking, when I reflect on myself speaking, even as I do it now, there is a sense of internalness. There is a sense of selfness there, that I am the thing that is speaking into this microphone, that I am expelling information into some environment that is not as intimately understood by myself, or not as intimately aware, in the sense that I am not as intimately aware with the environment that the information that I'm projecting enters into. Now, there's a way in which I probably should be thinking about this, and that is that the environment that the information is entering into, apart from being so broad and vast, that it is possible that outside of my material upbringing, that my thoughts, my words, the meaning is playing a part in a broader structure of meaning. That it is not just me talking into a vacuum, or a potential vacuum that may find some receptive ear somewhere, but rather there is a receptive ear everywhere. That I am heard in some facet. That my thoughts are not in vain. Of course, I can't say that this is a certainty other than by a degree of faith, but it affords us with another opportunity. Outside of just thinking about ourselves as some unfortunate carrier of consciousness in a broad vacuum of consciousness, rather, it affords us a certain way to think that our experience and our consciousness is playing a role in a much broader consciousness. And although we are not that consciousness, that our consciousness is similar in a way to that consciousness for which we participate in or participate with. And that we exist at a particular level or a particular layer of that experience. And much like a machine, it requires software, it requires hardware. Not everything that requires software or requires hardware is the same. There are different levels and scale of hardware and of software for different purposes, for different states of awareness, we could say, when it comes to the software and hardware in agentic beings. And especially as we're approaching this artificial intelligence agentic arena, I think it affords much more of a salient landscape. So the question is, where does the wicked fit into all of this? Because we can come up with useful models about the way of things, and there may be elements about it that don't quite work. There may be elements about it that work quite well. But ultimately, if we are not able to integrate our definitions into practical experience, then it remains a bit too abstract. So in this way, when we think about an intelligence landscape, we think about ourselves as agents. We think about the wicked, something of a topic that we have been discussing indirectly, but by virtue of the topic of this verse, it has been right on point. And that is that the wicked person has this idea of self, has a relationship to self, has a relationship to oneness that is grounded within the self, meaning that where the attention comes to, the highest point of that attention, is relegated into personal desire. And there's not much of a concern about developing the desire, about righteousness, about goodness. It's more so about a whim, I suppose, to a degree. I suppose that there are varying degrees of this wickedness, we might call it. But there is a way in which the selfish component and the barriers that are placed on our direction, our possibilities, by thinking so internally or selfishly, that there is a necessary aspect of this selfish desire that is propped up, put on the altar, worshipped. And the wicked person falls into this trap. They worship lust. I could just as easily say I for every single one of these. It's like I've said, I, just as many, have this internal tendency. It's a constant struggle to separate from. But this deification of the self, I think, is a principal quality of the wicked. And there's something within that experience, the process of submitting to the mind to itself in a strange way, that causes it to have no concern about a certain type of causality. There are many causes that produce many things. Impoverishment is one domain that has a certain set of causes that are associated with it, whatever the type of poverty we want to consider, whatever the type of lacking we want to consider. But more than just this, the mind that finds itself trapped within its own, here's the irony, the mind that finds itself trapped within its own experience, but also the mind that is unaware of the experience that could be had. It's a type of relating of the self. The problem is not the self, it's a problem of relating with the self. That if one is too wound up within it, that the identity is too closely tied with itself, that it doesn't sacrifice that thought of the internal environment being the most important thing, the autocentric vision of the universe. If it is able to see beyond this, I think what is shed is that hesitancy, the limitation, the anxiety about things that will never come to pass, about something that given our experience, given all the current constraints, that wonder and grace and beauty has, although it may exist to some tolerable degree, the mind that is so wound up within itself ends up rejecting that which truly brings it peace and joy. And I feel like the wicked person is on the road to such types of rejection, and at the ultimate end of that is nothing, is just absence, and that's evil. Scornful men bring a city into a snare, but wise men turn away wrath. Now this is a good verse to follow up with that previous one. Scornful men. So today happens to be a new day. A new day, new thoughts. And so I'd like to begin this recording with a prayer. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I could be here. I thank you that despite my failures, you have stayed with me. As a matter of feeling, perhaps, I know that there is something for me to hold on to. I know there is somewhere to go for refuge. It is because of this, because of your creation, that I find my way home. Just as a musical note may find resonance or harmony with another, I feel that when I engage and I pay attention, I'm able to find this resonance and harmony with you. For that, I'm thankful. In Jesus' name, amen. Scornful men bring a city into a snare, but wise men turn away wrath. So the word scornful, this is a term that was used, I think, fairly early on in the Proverbs, and it was used frequently. As I remember, it was quite a productive exercise to think about the scornful man. We have our big three, the fool, the wicked, and the evil. And the scornful occupies in my mind this interesting new creative space that isn't as common but still referred to enough that there is some memory of it. Now, I mentioned yesterday, for that previous recording, that this is a nice verse to follow it up with. Follow the previous verse up with. And I say that because the scornful man is much like the wicked man, in a way. A scornful man need not necessarily be wicked. I think scorn can come in a number of different ways and different states of mind. I think it directly relates to the two examples that I put forward, the Sunday dinner situation with friends, but also at work. There's a particular type of state of mind, I think, that I know that I can find myself in that leads to quite an unproductive mode. But maybe let's start by defining the word scornful. The definition of scornful is feeling or expressing contempt or derision. Now, earlier I had mentioned that state of mind as being something of a state of irritability. And while that may not be the exact same as the word scorn, I think that there is a relationship here. The definition of contempt, the feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, worthless, deserving scorn. Now, where I think it relates is within thingness, not necessarily of a person, although a person would be a subset of a thing. Not all things may necessarily be producing this state of irritability. But there's a certain aspect of thingness, I think, that, at least in my mind, in my heart, I find that production of irritability to be against certainly something, but there's more than just that. There's something fundamental about the nature of thingness, about the nature of something that can be identified, that can be interacted with, participated with. And as bad as that sounds, the mind is such an interesting thing. It wishes to hide, it wishes to run from even the slightest inconvenience at times. And perhaps this is a quality of my personality that just needs to change. And while this doesn't happen all of the time, if I really focus on it, I know it to be there. And I'm thankful that today I was able to catch this state of absence and state of irritability to existence, to experience, to taking in information of things. And I remember what I said yesterday about potentially reflecting on how this played out today. We may get there, we may not, but I do have a solid retention of yesterday's thoughts. And I had a solid retention of yesterday's thoughts going in the workday today. And I believe that it translated to a degree to my work, for which I am thankful. So we have this idea of the scornful man. We've defined contempt, this adverse production of the heart, a feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, worthless, deserving scorn, beneath consideration and worthless. To think about this for a moment, to think about the subject and to think about his will, to think about his place in deciding that which is above him or that which is that meets him, that he chooses to consider it, that it is not beneath him, or that something is valuable instead of worthless. It is a unique position, I think. A powerful position. To be in such a place, to decide what is valuable. When I say that, I think again about money. I think about the various contributions that we all play in the identification of that which is truly valuable. I think about the individual and of the vast possibilities for which any particular individual can be dissatisfied with the status quo or with the state of things and find something contemptible or find something worthless and wish to move away from that, to liberate themselves from those what they may feel or deem as arbitrary or again beneath consideration. Many times these forces that are above us make it so that we can't just push it aside and say that it is truly meaningless. We may not be right in doing so. There's great danger in the individual and having a strong sense of self. Also great beauty. As I've mentioned, the possibilities are vast. But within this potential, we do find the scornful man, again among this, the definition of the word scornful, feeling or expressing contempt or derision, a type of mockery. An air of insincerity, of not taking something truly into consideration, to put it off in the mind. Scornful men bring a city into a snare. There are so many potential roads here that we can choose. If we go off the one that I had mentioned earlier, just a moment ago, about how the self, how the individual relates to the collective determination of things, I have this tendency, probably because I'm an American, or perhaps because I'm a bit selfish, who knows. Hopefully the two are not equivalent. But I have this tendency to think that of the man that finds himself arbitrarily or perhaps deceptively coerced into a common understanding of things that perhaps isn't truly all that common. It is made common by the few. Then I can see how this contempt, perhaps, would find some utility in the mind. But going back to that last verse, it is of the righteous to find the cause of the poor, to find the cause of lacking. And if one is to truly be scornful and to consider something beneath consideration, to find something truly worthless, then they will not pursue the cause of that lacking. Even if they deem something to be corruptive value, there must be some cause, and there must be some attempt to determine what that cause is, and either to decide whether or not we ourselves are wrong in our assessment, or to find the truth to the matter, find the goodness that exists so we can correct our perceived concern. But there's another way in which this verse, I think, more readily takes us. Scornful men bring a city into a snare. In the United States, we have a fairly obvious example for which the governing class, the governing body, the governing authority has become so separated from the common people that their interest is primarily within themselves, and that they demonstrate this scorn for everybody that is outside of their bubble, or that doesn't participate in the web of corruption that exists. And it is because of this contempt that feeling that all of us are beneath them, that causes our concerns not to be met. It causes our concerns chronically not to be met over the course of generations. And these problems, they compound, and they take a toll on society. Economically, we suffer. In terms of our health, we suffer. In terms of our intelligence, I think we suffer. Our ability to discern and to solve our problems effectively, I think it weakens as our leadership weakens. We can imagine that this creates quite a precarious situation for institutions that should otherwise be quite sturdy and long-lasting. All of a sudden they become exposed, vulnerable, weak. Scornful men bring a city into a snare, but wise men turn away wrath. So what is this wrath? How can we define it? So a simple Google definition here. Extreme anger. Some of the similar words: anger, rage, fury, annoyance, indignation, outrage. Extreme anger. Now, the extremes of emotion, I have to imagine that they have a sort of a blinding quality to them, a blinding in terms of attention, that if something requires nuance, then it is likely to be sacrificed. It is likely to be sacrificed for that which is the thing that is most easily recognized. It is to be sacrificed for the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that which can be blamed most readily, even if it is false. There's some loose justification for it, and it is immediately visible, so that must be the thing that that is the cause of all of our problems. This type of thinking, I think, can come from a state of anger. A state of wrath, I think, perhaps maybe a little bit more extreme. I think of in the case of murder, or in the case of genocide, or in the case of rape, anything that involves this profound denial of awareness, we find wrath. Now, I've conceptualized anger in the past as a modified emotion. Modified in the sense that it is what can I say? It has been, it has gone through a process, like a manufacturing process, for which something is refined. It is not the raw material, but now it is usable. It is practical. Whereas the raw emotion, like I mentioned before, may be that irritability. When something turns to anger, there is a reason for it. There's some logic behind it, even if it is superficial, even if it is distorted by intensity. So I think we have to ask the question, in what way does a wise person save a city from wrath? Or turn away wrath? Wisdom, I think, is a posture of seeing the interconnectedness of things. It is of seeing the finite, but also the big picture, the microcosm for the macrocosm. It is a general disposition, even if a wise person is uncertain, that there must be a conclusion that is come to avoid the extremes of our behaviors and our emotions that would otherwise ruin our attention, ruin our relationships, ruin our connections. Going back to an idea from earlier, it is avoiding the scornful disposition of finding oneself in a place where they think of many things to be beneath them. And what they find to be valuable, perhaps it really isn't all that valuable, and they are denying themselves true value. In my case, perhaps that state of irritability, however rudimentary it might be, unfortunately provides me with limited possibilities for connection and for growth with my friends at those Sunday dinners. It is to my detriment that I abandon the wise man that exists within all of us and take a more scornful approach. If a wise man contends with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there is no rest. So today is a new day, new thoughts. So I'll begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. Today is one of those days, a day that I've complained about often, a day that comes off of a period of poor rest. For whatever reason, I didn't sleep well last night. And the day of fatigue has found me during the day today, especially right now. And I keep in mind, as best I can, the dangers of the misleadings of the heart. And I find myself tempted at this moment and other moments to find a place of existence, of experience for which I am not responsible for anything, that I can just let it go, much like a state of slumber, but as I've spoken of many times, as my mind has centered on many times perhaps, the places of a desire to still be present in this experience, but not present enough, such that I have to go through the suffering or pain. It is the denial of the aspect of life that must necessarily be dealt with. And there is a belief that the satisfaction that would come from such a superficial pressure release will actually be good for me instead of the opposite. And so coming to you in this state of mind, I want to say that I am sorry for the inclination, but I'm also grateful and thankful for the awareness of it. And with this, in Jesus' name I pray, amen. If a wise man contends with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there is no rest. So a good verse coming off of that prayer, for rest is a pivotal term in this verse. It is something that we must contend with. if a wise man contends with a foolish man. Now let's find ourselves in a space. What does it mean to contend with somebody? When I think about contend, I think of the word contender, potentially facing off with somebody in maybe an argument, a debate. I also think about the word contentious, which has an idea of struggle, facing something, dealing with something. The wise man, as we have just finished talking about, is a person that is aware of a broad scale of things. They are not unlimited in their knowledge, of course, nor do they wish to be unlimited in their knowledge. But they possess a state of mind that is aware of their place and of their place relative to others, their place relative to the environment, the interrelatedness of things, and of the appropriateness of those relations. The fool is nearly somebody that is opposite, somebody that is ignorant to their position, that has a certain social standing, perhaps, that by their will, by their poor merits, they have chosen a way of life that is superficial, not necessarily vain, but it's choosing ignorance for the sake of ignorance, to a degree. The fool, much like the wise person, all of these tropes, I think, find their place within our minds. The fool has its role. There's a comedic aspect to this trope. There's a lack of insincerity, in the sense that of sincerity there is a lack of it. Or maybe I should say a degree of seriousness that is lacking. There's a lot of light-hearted thinking with regard to the fool. And perhaps the fool doesn't really care to think too deeply, too much about the relationship among things. So given this basic relationship between these two, when we find them contending with one another, what necessarily follows? If a wise man contends with a foolish man, regardless of his disposition at that moment, humorous or angry, rageful, there is no rest. And there must be a rather delicate way to approach this. For what is necessarily rest from a person who is foolish? There is the implication that because of the way of the foolish person, because of the way of the fool, there's an unrelenting contention. That it is like I believe the Escher's staircase. It never seems to really end. That paradox of continual, perhaps in the case of a contention, continual reasoning or false reasoning, poor reasoning, that can never be satisfied by a wise person's words or by reason. And so I come back to this idea about rest, and just as I've mentioned there, about satisfying something. That the anxious mind, or the curious mind, the mind that has undergone some conflict, speaking of contention, that surely a mind that is involved in such a thing is readily able to see that there may be some end, but depending on the way in which one approaches a conflict, that end may appear to them achievable under differing circumstances. On the part of the wise person, I would imagine the end would be to find a logical conclusion, but not just logical. Logical and meaningful and integrative, in the sense that it is one thing to answer a question, but it's another thing to answer a question within a broader web or network of related things that gives one a bigger picture. And there's a way in which one, perhaps, that can approach a contention with the goal in mind of just winning an argument, of beating a person back or falling back into where they feel comfortable. And that could be in a place of absence. That could be in a place of insincerity. Insincerity, again, in the sense that the person is not putting forth the conscious effort to actually consider the point of another. And so no matter what somebody says, the information that is being transmitted is just lost on the person who just does not wish to process and synthesize that information, even if it is to their benefit and even if it is truthful. Surely that would be kind of a foolish thing to do. So then we can see that an individual that lacks a receptive quality, or that may only receive certain elements, the elements that are not sufficient to hold any transformation or possibility for transformation. And it doesn't have to be placing the blame all on the foolish person, necessarily, in terms of their, what can I say, their place of understanding, where they are intellectually. I don't think that this has anything to do with it. It has to do with the will and the desire to reciprocate, and to find another, wise or not, on a similar plane, such that they can relate, and that they don't abandon such important aspects of our relating, of communicating, that they are unable to, as I've said, process information. But such a situation, such a person, to engage with them by traditional means would have no effect. And so I'd have to imagine that rest in this situation, or satisfaction, that a contention, regardless of the parties involved, is unlikely to be arrived. But digging a little bit farther, this is a point that I keep wishing to get at, about this idea of satisfaction and rest. What would it mean for the wise person to find himself in a state of rest? if he is speaking to a person, let's say the person is not a fool, and so this issue of rest is not on the horizon, but rather he is speaking to somebody for which there is contention, but he is able to find rest. Of what I've spoken of, what can we say? Is it the possibility that there is a mutual reciprocation, a mutual understanding, that some new experience has been born and now unfolds, such that the original contention was more of a seed that had wrought a productive and fruitful environment? Is it simply the tying down of that contention, such that it no longer plagues, it is no longer a struggle? What has been taken on has been dealt with. The position or the argument has held by solid argumentation. Do we mean by rest and by satisfaction that there is something about the state of mind that the person, the wise person, actually engages in? I think I am somewhat inclined to say yes, but also somewhat inclined to say no. I'm inclined to say no because of where we have been so far in the last few verses in this episode. That there has been a lot of focus on this state of absence of mind. And in my experience, just thinking about the prayers over the past couple of days, that they have been heavily focused on being present, being attentive, not moving into that mental state of absence, for which sometimes it can be so difficult to break away from once I have fallen into it. Rest in this situation is, although one can identify this as a restful state of mind, I would not consider this to be a good state of mind. I would not consider this a place for a wise person to be. And so I don't think that we can necessarily call this the place of rest for the wise person. But rather, rest, I think, has to involve some of these components of fruitful labor, of successfully surmounting something. But at the top of that mount, it is not turn the switch off and have the cognitive machine turn to nothing. I think it involves a continual process of willful experience, that because this is accomplished, great. We either move on to the next thing, or we stay in this place and we try to maximize the merits that were born of it. Maybe we repair parts of the relationship that were damaged by the struggle, which undoubtedly in most struggles there is some sort of damage that takes place. If a wise man contends with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there is no rest. The last thing that comes to mind here, before we move on to the next verse, is the transition to night, or from day to night, from night to day in Genesis. The idea of some ending, the ending of a cycle. The ending of a cycle doesn't mean the complete ending. It means that of a particular type of creative process, that has run its course, and some time will pass before the cycle begins anew. But in the off time, within the darkened environment, it doesn't imply nothingness. There's plenty of somethingness. Somethingness that was created in the light is now continuing to exist in the dark. but the same productive energy is not necessarily taking place. Solving the contention is not something that exists perpetually. Otherwise we run into this paradox of the fool and the wise person, continually going at this contention and never solving anything, a hamster wheel that goes nowhere, the Escher staircase. But rather, in the off period, there is this mind that considers, a mind that understands and is aware of what had happened in the light. As the mind in the darkness approaches the light, I think what it finds is a new creative process. Not necessarily a new contention, but a new dilemma or problem, however it may appear. The bloodthirsty hate the upright, but the just seek his soul. So let's talk a little bit about this word bloodthirsty. Not in a physical sense or in a literal sense, I don't necessarily think it means that there are people that, much like they thirst for water to satisfy their bodily needs, that another thirsts for blood. Of course, the blood is symbolic of something more. It is symbolic for the life of a person. That the bloodthirsty, in this sense, are the people that either wish to physically harm or to destroy the righteous, so that they are not in their way, so that the wicked can continue to proliferate and to operate their corrupt schemes that parasitize society, that form like a cancer. There is the other sort, thirsty for blood, in the way that they are desiring of life, to control it, to have more of it. Just as we have blood flowing through our veins to sustain us, without it we would not be able to experience, live. To have more, we can extend our experience. To have an extension of blood, let's say. To have a slave, or to be in control of who knows what. The bloodthirsty hate the upright. The upright, sort of a derivative of the righteous. The people that stand tall, that they don't necessarily bow to any one person, they bow to a singular authority, but that singular authority is beyond man, that is beyond immediate concerns. That because of their decision to sacrifice a part of themselves for something greater, that it affords them a certain distinction, that they are able to be honest in a way that perhaps somebody else is not, respectable. The bloodthirsty hate the upright, but the just seek his soul. So thinking a little bit more about these dynamics, the bloodthirsty hating the upright, I think there's plenty more to understand about the bloodthirsty and about the upright, to understand the hatred that may exist between that bloodthirsty person and the upright person. It's quite difficult to paint that picture. It's quite difficult to understand out of all the possibilities of this bloodthirsty person, where exactly do they rest? Same can be said of the upright. Ontology is not an easy subject, at least for me. Understanding myself is difficult enough, and I can barely do that. The self is such a dynamic thing, constantly changing, but also bizarrely, almost paradoxically, finding within itself a degree of unity, a degree of coherence that we can actually identify as being one thing, as being the self. So my apologies for the break in the continuity of that last recording, but today is a new day. And as always, a new day, new thoughts. And with this new day, just listening to that past recording, I remember that I was just at the beginning of getting into that verse, and nothing yet substantial had been embarked upon. So like usual, we're going to start with a prayer to open this up. Dear Lord, I thank you that I can be here today. I thank you that I have the opportunity to focus my mind, to direct my attention. Without this experience, without this directed attention, without being able to direct myself towards a higher purpose, towards you, to give myself into something that holds me, something that keeps me, but that is something that is not entirely me. For me is an opportunity to keep life fresh. It gives life meaning. For without it, those stagnant thoughts and the insular nature would consume me. And I am forever grateful for the conscious experience beyond me. And Lord, with this I pray, in Jesus' name, amen. The bloodthirsty hate the upright, but the just seek his soul. So as I mentioned last time, I was not quite satisfied with the basic introduction that I had proposed for the bloodthirsty. I've spoken of many times of the various tropes that are of a species that occupy the human experience, the human mind. And oftentimes there are many tropes that I think consistently occupy us, that although we wish to be completely free from them, they nonetheless hold stake in our experience, like that of the fool, perhaps like that of the wicked person. On a more positive note, like that of the righteous person or the just person, the good person. And when I think about the bloodthirsty person, I think about where in myself does that quality exist, or where does the road to that experience exist. And I suppose there are a number of ways to get there, to find one's disposition bloodthirsty. But I'd like to go over the word again just to reestablish some context. To be bloodthirsty, as we've described, is not a physical thing. We're not describing a person that has a appetite, a literal physical appetite for blood, but rather to control life, either to control it in the way of an ending, or controlling for their own purposes and more of a wicked pursuit. There are plenty of ways in which a person can control something. If I take this penny out of the cubby in front of me, and I have it in my hand, I am grasping it, I have a certain degree of control over this object, this item. And because I have it, because I am related to it in such a way that I own this, I can use it in whichever way I please, for the most part. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to spend too much time, or rather be so exhaustive in saying that the bloodthirsty is only the type of person that brings an ending to life, or by their control leads to the ending of life. Because as I've mentioned, there are plenty of ways that one can control something, including the life of another. Now, there is an aspect of literal or physical thirst here, in the sense that we can desire many things, in the sense that we can have our somatic desires to satiate the body, to perpetuate its experience and existence. There are concerns of mind. There are social needs, emotional needs. We can be lacking or expansive, learned in many different domains of the appetites. But among the various appetites, unfortunately, there are those that can be considered contrary, negative, evil. And among this dimension of appetite, I think there exists an antagonism, a fundamental antagonism to that of the righteous way of things, that it causes this verse, of course, to be true. Now, not to linger on that too long, because there's not much value in that statement. But what I think is truly valuable, the place to go from here, is into the experience of the self. To think about our appetites, our own appetites, and how these destructive, contrary, or negative appetites might inhibit our own expression of uprightness, of moral fortitude, of the concern, the attention towards goodness itself, whether or not we make a mistake. I think back to C.S. Lewis here for a moment, and I think about the situation of the relative good, in the sense that even among the evil or the wicked, what they believe and their behavior, the extension of themselves into the environment of the world, however that may manifest through their offspring or through their deeds, through what they produce in society. They ultimately, at some level, believe that this behavior is good. Now, with the evil, I find it an interesting circumstance, because the evil type tends towards absence. And on the higher level of this evil hierarchy, perhaps, when I say higher level, I mean level of awareness, that they are aware of the way of things, or the way that things can be. They are aware of goodness as the way that the best of the human mind tends to believe it to be. If I could just give it some qualities for a moment, just as a placeholder. But certainly I don't pretend to be able to understand how to encapsulate goodness in a simple definition. But certainly a people, a small group, an individual that is concerned about the affairs of others, that sacrifices an aspect of themselves to bring about a type of harmony, a type of resonance, such that people come to greater understanding, greater awareness, greater harmony, that despite of the complexities that surround them, the individuals that they find within their midst are not something to be repulsed at, but rather to be enjoyed, to be loved, and that these individuals, that they understand how to communicate and embrace each other. They don't shy away from looking each other in the eyes. They don't shy away from trying to understand somebody, to be intimate in a way that affords a type of communication and expression, a display of love, again, that's somewhat wound up in sacrifice, that there is a giving and there is a receiving, there is this reciprocal affordance between the two parties. And among the self, among the various elements of the self, that this is also reflected there, that there is a sense of grace in the communication with the self. There is a sense of criticality, surely, but that criticality is not enough to paralyze the individual. The individual develops principles and moves forward upon them, makes mistakes, surely, but has the forethought, the awareness, the prudence to understand that this is a part of life. And while making a mistake is not good, it is up to them to correct that mistake and to move forward. But despite the awareness of such possibilities on the part of the evil person, they still engage in that pursuit of nothingness, to destroy for the sake of destruction, to break down for the sake of multiplicity. They tend towards disunity for the sake of disunity. Now, the matter of hate comes into play here. It's a crucial link. And I'm debating on how best to approach understanding this word. I've gone through this exercise a few different times. And it's always a fun experience to do it, assuming that the mind is invested in doing so. But like usual, I think I want to explore the etymological roots, but also, even without the direct link to English, I'd like to explore just generally some cultural understandings of the word hate. But perhaps I'll come to that. What comes to mind, though, is a few things. One, I think the etymological consideration and the definition that is to be had will provide us with some additional good information. But also, I think that in order to establish this link between the bloodthirsty and the upright, hatred must be understood on a personal level, on a almost an intuitive level. And to get there, I think we have to be able to really understand the conflict that is generated between these two conflicting ideas or visions. And while I think I've discussed quite a bit about the bloodthirsty, I suppose there is some work to do still at understanding the upright. And then whatever fruit may come about when thinking about the connection, the meeting point between these two opposing visions of life. But what necessarily must result at the end of it, if we are taking this all the way to its conclusion, is a fairly solid definition of anger, or hate, rather. So to take some time here to spend on the upright, just a quick Google definition of the word upright. I'll read the few definitions here. Sitting or standing with the back straight, of a person or their behavior strictly honorable or honest. And I don't think necessarily that the anatomical definition is all that different from the uprightness in the honorable sense. There's a way in which this meaning of straightness, or even the physical quality of being upright, is a position of, is a desirable position. It's a position of attention. We don't necessarily think of, if we think anatomically, we think about maybe the archetype of an upright person. We paint this image in our minds, this, again, the archetypal image. What I don't see is somebody laying down on some grassy plain somewhere, sleeping. I don't see somebody sitting in front of the television. I don't see somebody looking down at their phone. Perhaps I see somebody sitting at the family table, engaged in a conversation, looking at somebody in their eyes. I think about a person that is reflective, standing tall, peering out into the landscape, again, thinking for some reason about the open field, the plain, and the person just gazing out at that plain, arms behind their back, perhaps a degree of squint, a furrowed brow. This is what I think of the posture of an upright person. As I've mentioned, there are many tropes of man's experience. I think there are many degrees of these tropes that we experience. It does me well to reflect on these individual tropes, and for the past couple of weeks, I've been really trying to think about my behavior and why I am the way that I am, if there are things about myself that I should change for the better, and undoubtedly there are. There are plenty of things that I can find. And when I think about myself, both in terms of the uprightness that currently exists in me, but also the understanding of the upright that I perhaps at times critically, maybe too much critically, admonish myself for not being able to live up to a particular standard. The first thing that comes to mind, and I know that this is going to be a bit exploratory, this definition is great and everything, but I found that, at least in my mind, I don't know if anybody's different, but when I see a definition, especially something that's a bit complicated, simple words, simple definitions, fine, it's easy to understand, but something like the upright, I read of a person or their behavior strictly honorable or honest. I can kind of understand honesty. Honorable is a bit more difficult. There are plenty of things that bleed into that. At what point does somebody become honorable? Certainly it involves adhering to particular principles. But nobody is perfect all the time. And I always ask myself this question especially after I feel that I've done something well, or maybe particularly honorable. And by the way, the definition of honorable is being, bringing, or worthy of honor. That doesn't help at all. Used as a title indicating eminence, distinction, given to people of high moral standing. If I type in honor, just for a moment, it is defined as high respect, great esteem. Similar words: distinction, privilege, glory, tribute. The second definition: adherence to what is right or to some conventional standard of conduct. So when I think about the times, again, where I feel a bit elated that I've done something correctly, usually I attribute or identify an honorable quality when it has to do with interacting between people. And again, I do not claim that I'm perfect. I'm just trying to identify the upright trope within myself, so that I can grasp it, and I could hopefully build on that. But usually when I find honor, I find respect because I've expressed something to somebody out of a domain of understanding. And the domain of understanding and the effectiveness of communication has brought the two of us, or more, into a mutual plane of understanding, that the truth is shared now between us. And a lot of what has to do with that, or what builds into that or leads up to it, is competence. It is knowing what I am doing. And of course I think about work in this situation. And again, I can't claim to be the best professional. I am not. I am fairly early on in my career, but I'm thankful that I have at least had a few instances for which I have felt some degree of success. I felt respected because I've done something well. There are plenty of cases where I have failed and I have felt terrible, and I understand by those failures where I should correct and move forward. But just identifying this, I suppose, is good. It adds to our definition that competence is necessary, that reciprocation is important. If it is between people, or an event that involves communication between two people, then there must be good communication. There must be shared goals. There must be an establishment of shared goals, a shared orientation of attention. And ultimately, these shared goals, shared orientation of attention, bring us to a place that, at least in my mind, is holistic in the sense that what has been achieved is the object of our efforts, but also something a little bit more. The object of our efforts, and then the expansion of the insight, the expansion of that conscious landscape. By that I mean that when we think about a problem, we don't just think about the immediate solution that we've come to. We think about a broad set of possibilities. We think about the principles that have led us there. It's more of a colored-in version or a high-resolution experience. I think about this when I think about how the upright person might deal with something. Okay, so we have these two contrasting views. On the part of the bloodthirsty, there is this hate, this intense anger. And the intense anger, I have to imagine, exists because of the poles, of the two opposites, the two ontological opposites, that there is such tension on the part of the bloodthirsty. I can't imagine that perhaps the upright have a degree of hatred for this type of person. It's hard to say. Hate may be a strong thing for an upright person. I have to imagine that an upright person is good at controlling their emotions, and that hate perhaps is not necessarily an emotion, although it may happen to an upright person. It is not something that they find themselves consistently dwelling on or stewing in. Eventually grace and forgiveness comes in, but also absence of surrender. There will be strength in the face of the bloodthirsty. But in terms of the bloodthirsty, I would have to imagine that this mode of regulation is not as strong, that they are not really geared towards that type of good, that integrative good, that pulls all things into some sort of harmony, rather than separating things out into disunity and disharmony, and creating profound dissonance. So where we are is that, at least in terms of our definition of hatred, is that it can be born of antagonism. It's born of pressure. It is born of difference. It is born of perceived difference. That if the bloodthirsty was not bloodthirsty, that they were upright, even if the upright, maybe if the upright had different views of the way to being an upright person, I suppose this could create a degree of antagonism between the two. But there's all sorts of little details that one would have to sift through to understand which party is actually at fault. That aside, though, thinking about this difference, thinking about ontological differences, the way in which one is oriented, the way in which one places their attention. I don't think it is true that in every case of difference, or that in every case of tension, that there is hate. So it's not, although it may be an element or part of a set of conditions that may bring it about, it is not exclusively that. As I mentioned earlier, hate is an intense anger. Anger in and of itself, I don't think is a base emotion. I think irritability is a base emotion. Anger, I think, implies a degree of reason. And then hate is just ratcheting up the intensity of feeling and of desire. Other things that it may be born of are jealousy or injustice. But before I move on, and this will probably be the last thought, or at least attempt at some thought before I end this episode and move on to the next verse, there is something although I mentioned that I thought antagonism and this tension was not the whole of hate, and I still maintain that, but I think that there's something so fundamental. There's something fundamental in the spiritual mechanics of hate and tension that I would like to explore a little bit. Now, when I say that, I thought of, my mind jumps to so many different places, never really completes a thought sometimes, but what I thought of was my friend, for whatever reason. I think because I had just finished a conversation with him not too long ago about the nature of migraines. And he was hypothesizing about the causes of a migraine. And I don't know what causes a migraine. I can hypothesize just as well. But he gave me a bunch of material causes, and before he started doing this, he said that after he saw his doctor about it, they came to the conclusion that it was a stress-induced migraine. It was a particularly stressful job, and I'm not surprised that that is the cause. But it's an interesting cause. Stress, at least the term, I think, is not one that we associate with physical causes, although there are physical causes to it. What I mean is that this idea of a stress-induced migraine is something that is quite intuitive. It involves the awareness of the self beyond just understanding the material causes, which might be useful to a degree, but the stress is much more of a relatable term. We don't immediately go to, oh, my cortisol levels are up when we feel stressed. It's in the moment things are happening to us. The experience is beyond just mere examination of those material causes. And I suppose I thought about that to a degree because I thought of this tension and this antagonism. And I also thought about how intimate this experience of hatred or anger, just intense emotion in general, actually can be. And also, since I mentioned spiritual mechanics, when we wish to moderate ourselves to be more like the upright person who's in control of their emotions, not lacking in emotion, but it just in control of them, so it doesn't take him beyond his own control, perhaps. Or when he surrenders to it, then he surrenders to it gracefully. This tension. People also ironically call a certain type of headache a tension headache. As far as the bloodthirsty is concerned, because I think directionally speaking, the hatred is coming from this type of person. I think the antagonism is more than just the dislike to or the awareness of the ontological differences between the bloodthirsty and the upright. I think it's the very mode, the very participation in life that the bloodthirsty person has. Now, the upright may be a key to set off that chain of negative emotion, but they are primed for it. Their very being is primed for that antagonism and that negative emotion. I think the very self, by their very wish and their very desire to behave in such a way that things disintegrate before them, this is at the end of the road, obviously, but even more mild forms at which a person may wish to control everything. There is a a desire to have everything within their grasp, to throw a rope around every single thing and bring it into their orbit. And if any little thing is outside of their control, then it prompts them to lasso that thing and to bring it in again. And it creates such a multiplicitous force on their being that I think it's probably painful. They have all these spiritual ropes tied to this, that, and the other thing. I think about abusive partners trying to control their spouse, whatever it might be, whether it be because of past trauma that they have experienced in their childhood, whatever. I think the ropes that they tie in that spiritual landscape begin to pull at their soul. It begins to corrupt it. It begins to narrow that hole for which the divine grace can enter into. And so what spews forth is hate. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'll continue next time with verse 11.